The Sodder family background. George and Ginny were Italian immigrants who had come to America seeking a better life. George, strong and determined, built a prosperous business hauling coal. The Sodder family was well respected, but George had opinions that set him apart. He was openly critical of Benito Mussolini and fascist rule in Italy, even within a community where many Italian Americans still admired their homeland's leader. This earned him enemies, people who muttered that George would pay for his words one day. But George dismissed threats easily. His focus was on his family, and that family was large, lively, and full of dreams. There were 10 children in total, ranging from the eldest, John, to the youngest, little Sylvia, just 2 years old. Their house, though humble, was always alive with sound. On that Christmas Eve, with stockings hung and the smell of pine and wood smoke in the air, the Sodder children gathered around their gifts. Jenny, practical but kind, finally called them to bed near midnight. Some resisted. The older ones pleaded to stay awake a little longer. Jenny relented. It was Christmas, after all. No one could know it would be their last night together. On Christmas Eve, 1945, in the quiet Appalachian town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, the Sodder family prepared for what should have been a night of peace. Snow fell silently over the hills. Lights twinkled in homes across the valley. The war had ended just months earlier, and across America, families looked forward to a Christmas of joy, relief, and new beginnings. But in one house on that cold December night, destiny would take a darker turn. The Sodder home, a 2-story wooden house, stood proudly at the edge of Route 16. Inside lived George and Jenny Sodder, along with 9 of their 10 children. Their life, though modest, was filled with the warmth of family and tradition. The children's laughter echoed through the halls that night. Marion, the eldest daughter, had surprised her siblings with toys from her job at the dime store. The younger one stayed awake, playing, refusing to surrender to sleep. For a moment, all was well. A family together, a home alive with light, a celebration of life after war. But by dawn, that house would be gone, reduced to ash, and 5 of those children would vanish into the smoke. The outbreak of the fire. Half an hour later, Jenny awoke again. This time, it was not a sound that stirred her. It was the smell of smoke. She rushed to the hallway. Flames had already begun climbing the walls of the wooden house. The fire moved with terrifying speed, consuming everything in its path. "George! The children!" she screamed. Chaos followed. George and Jenny grabbed little Sylvia and some of the older children. But as the family fled the burning home, they realized 5 of the children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were still trapped upstairs. George tried desperately to re-enter the house, but the staircase was already engulfed. The flames roared, blocking every path. He ran outside to fetch a ladder that he always kept against the side of the house. But the ladder was gone, vanished. He tried starting his coal trucks to drive near the window and rescue the children. Neither truck would start, despite having worked perfectly the day before. Neighbors ran to help, but the fire burned too hot, too fast. In just 45 minutes, the Sodder home collapsed into a pile of ash, and the 5 children were gone. The strange phone call. Around 12:30 a.m., the house had gone quiet. Jenny had slipped into bed, her husband already asleep beside her. The fire in the hearth had dimmed. Snowflakes tapped gently against the windows. Then the telephone rang. Jenny sat up, puzzled. Who would call so late on Christmas Eve? She answered, pressing the receiver to her ear. A woman's voice, unfamiliar, spoke quickly, asking for someone Jenny had never heard of. Behind the woman's words came sounds of clinking glasses, laughter, the noise of a party. "You must have the wrong number," Jenny said politely. The woman laughed strangely, an unsettling, almost mocking sound, before hanging up. Jenny set the phone back in place. Something about that laugh lingered in her mind, but she returned to bed, dismissing it as a wrong number. She did not know it was the beginning of something far more sinister. Desperate rescue attempts. Outside the burning house, George Sodder's desperation grew with each second. Flames licked the night sky, consuming the home he had built with his own hands. Inside, 5 of his children were trapped. Their cries could no longer be heard, only the roar of the fire. George rushed to the side of the house where his ladder always leaned. But the space was empty. The ladder had vanished. In panic, he turned his coal trucks. He would drive one against the house, climb onto the roof, and rescue his children from the upstairs window. But when he turned the key, the truck refused to start. He tried the second one. Dead. Both trucks, perfectly functional the day before, failed him at the very moment he needed them most. Neighbors had gathered, some with buckets of water, but it was useless. The fire was too intense. The wooden beams collapsed one after another. The Sodder home groaned and fell in on itself, sparks shooting into the snowy night. Jenny held little Sylvia close, her face pale, her body trembling. The other children stood in shock, their eyes wide, tears freezing on their cheeks. And George screamed into the night, his voice breaking with helplessness. The aftermath. By dawn, all that remained of the Sodder home was a smoking pile of ash. In just 45 minutes, their lives had been torn apart. The Fayetteville Fire Department did not arrive until later that morning. Their explanation was simple: a shortage of manpower, a wartime delay. But to George and Jenny, it was another failure, another moment where help had not come. The chief of the volunteer fire department searched the ruins. He claimed to find no remains, suspicious details. The deeper George and Jenny looked, the stranger the details became. The missing ladder was found weeks later, tossed into a ditch far from the house. A telephone repairman confirmed that the Sodder's phone line had not burned. It had been cut. Someone had climbed the pole, sliced the wires, and vanished into the night. Witnesses claimed they saw a man watching the Sodder home in the days before the fire. Another neighbor swore they saw objects being thrown onto the roof during the blaze, objects that looked like firebombs. The story no longer seemed like an accident. It began to feel like an attack. But who would want to destroy the Sodder family? And why? The authorities respond. Despite all of these details, the authorities held firm to their official explanation: faulty wiring. An unfortunate accident. But George insisted the wiring had been inspected recently and found safe. How could safe wiring ignite a fire so suddenly, so completely, on a snowy night? When George and Jenny begged the police to reopen the case, they were dismissed. The fire department insisted the children had perished in the flames. Case closed. But for the Sodders, it was only the beginning. The billboard campaign. In the years that followed, George and Jenny refused to give up. They printed flyers. They sent letters. They demanded answers. But perhaps their boldest act came in 1952, when George erected a massive billboard along Route 16 near the ruins of the home. On it were the faces of his 5 missing children. In bold letters, the sign asked the world, what was their fate? Kidnapped? Murdered? Or still alive? Drivers passing through West Virginia could not ignore it. The billboard stood for decades, a haunting reminder of unanswered questions, of parents who would never stop searching. Strange sightings after the fire. Not long after the fire, whispers began spreading across Fayetteville. A woman claimed she had seen the missing Sodder children peering from a passing car on the night of the fire. Another woman, working at a motel between Fayetteville and Charleston, said she had seen the children the morning after, accompanied by 2 men and 2 women of Italian appearance. She recalled how the adults did not let the children speak, how they seemed frightened, and how the group quickly checked out. Weeks later, in a diner in West Virginia, a waitress swore she overheard children's voices. They matched the descriptions of the Sodder kids. But before she could look closer, the group vanished into the road. Each story added fuel to the fire of suspicion. Could the children really have escaped the blaze? Could someone have taken them? Theories of kidnapping. George and Ginny could not ignore the strange details. The cut phone line, the missing ladder, the failed trucks, the threats George had received about his outspoken political views. One theory suggested the children had been kidnapped in retaliation for George's anti-Mussolini statements. Italy's dictator had been executed just months earlier, but sympathizers still existed. Was this an act of revenge against a man who dared to speak against fascism? Others whispered of mafia involvement. Perhaps George had angered the wrong men in his coal business dealings. Perhaps the fire had been set as a warning, and the children taken as leverage. Still others believed in a local conspiracy, that certain townsfolk knew more than they admitted, that the investigation had been deliberately rushed to hide the truth. But in every theory, one thing remained. The children were not dead. They had been taken. A letter from Kentucky. In 1947, a woman wrote to the Sodders from St. Louis. She claimed she had overheard strangers discussing a Christmas Eve fire in West Virginia and how children had been stolen from their home. Another tip came from Florida. Someone swore the Sodder children were living with distant relatives there. George traveled again and again, chasing every lead, no matter how far. He drove across the country, knocking on doors, pleading for answers. Each time, he returned empty-handed. But one story haunted him most, that of a woman in Kentucky who said she had met the Sodder children in a boarding house. She remembered their names. She remembered their faces. But by the time George arrived, the children were gone. The photograph in the mail. In 1967, more than 20 years after the fire, Ginny received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a black and white photograph of a young man in his 20s. On the back, written in unfamiliar handwriting, were the words, "Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie. Ill boys, a 90132 or 35. Ginny stared at the photo for hours. The man's face bore a striking resemblance to her missing son Louis, who had vanished at age 9. The strong jaw, the dark eyes, the shape of his nose. Was this proof? Was her son alive, living under a new identity? George and Ginny hired a private investigator to track the envelope's origin. The man took the case and disappeared, never to be heard from again. The photograph was never explained. A life of searching. The Sodders never stopped. For the rest of their lives, they searched. George drove thousands of miles, following rumors, knocking on strangers' doors. Ginny wore black for the rest of her days, a symbol of mourning for children she did not believe were dead, but stolen. The billboard remained on Route 16, haunting passers-by for decades. The faces of the 5 missing children stared at all who passed, asking questions no one could answer. By the time George died in 1969 and Ginny in 1989, the truth had still not been found. And today, the mystery remains. The family's final years. As the decades passed, the Sodders grew older, but the weight of the mystery never lifted. George spent the rest of his life chasing shadows. Every rumor, every letter, every whispered story of children resembling his own pulled him back onto the road. He drove thousands of miles across America, searching for answers. Each journey ended in disappointment. Jenny, meanwhile, transformed their home into a shrine. She surrounded herself with flowers, photographs of the missing children, and the haunting black-and-white picture of the young man who might have been Lewis. She dressed in black for the rest of her life, a symbol of grief, but also of unyielding faith that her children were still out there. When George died in 1969, he went to his grave without knowing the truth. Jenny carried the torch alone for 2 more decades until her own death in 1989. Their surviving children, now grown, inherited both the mystery and the burden. And still, the answers never came. Theories that endure. To this day, the disappearance of the Sodder children remains unsolved. But theories continue to circulate. Some believe the fire was a tragic accident and that the children's bodies were simply destroyed beyond recognition, a rare but possible outcome. Skeptics argue that grief made the Sodders see conspiracies where there were none, but others point to the details that refuse to vanish. The missing ladder, later found discarded in a ditch. The trucks that failed to start at the exact moment they were needed. The cut phone line. The eyewitness accounts of children seen alive after the fire. The mysterious photograph mailed to Jenny decades later. If it was an accident, why so many coincidences? Why so many unanswered questions? And if it was not an accident, who took the Sodder children and why? The billboard's final days. For nearly 40 years, the billboard on Route 16 stood as a ghostly reminder. Drivers could not miss the faces of the 5 missing children staring back at them, their eyes frozen in time, their names calling out for recognition. In the 1980s, after Jenny's passing, the sign was finally removed. But by then, it had become legend, a piece of West Virginia folklore, a story that refused to die, a haunting legacy. Today, more than 70 years later, the disappearance of the Sodder children still captures the imagination of true crime enthusiasts, historians, and storytellers. It is a story of loss, of perseverance, and of a mystery that defies resolution. It is the story of parents who refuse to accept official explanations, who fought against silence, who demanded answers that never came. The Sodder children would be elderly now if alive. Their parents are long gone. But the questions remain, echoing through the hills of West Virginia, carried by every retelling of their tale. Did they die in the flames that Christmas Eve? Or did they live, hidden away, stolen from their family, never to return? No matter the answer, the truth has slipped beyond reach. And so the Sodder children remain lost. The disappearance of the Sodder children is more than a mystery. It is a wound that never healed, a reminder that sometimes the most haunting stories are not those born of legends, but those rooted in reality. A fire, a night of celebration turned into tragedy. 5 children vanished, and after all the searching, all the theories, all the hope, only silence remains. Perhaps one day the truth will surface. But until then, the story of the Sodder children drifts between history and myth, a puzzle left unsolved, a mystery that lingers in the shadows of America's past.